something had gone right. I was 2 years ahead of Francis Hope at Eton. I jumped 2 years. And I spent most of after I got the scholarship, I got it in December, wandering around Europe, mostly with my mother. She let me go my own.
So you left the school?
I left the school. There's no point in staying. So I went around. A lot of it I spent in Italy, and the rest in France.
What else happened at the school? I mean, were you doing anything else?
Well,
any hobbies or interests?
I played chess, and the great run of St Paul's chess began with the people who were running it when I moved in and joined them. But not me, but I was, as it were, the immediate successor, one of the immediate successors. St Paul's chess team, when I came, for the 3 and a bit years I was there, I lost one match. And that was very, very important, because at this point we wanted a chess tie for sporting respectability. And I was delegated by the club. I was then, I don't know, secretary or treasurer or something, but something not terribly important there, but deeply involved in the training programs of training our successors, which we took with incredible seriousness. That's why St Paul's became so very, very good. Your duty as a good chess player was to train the next generation, which we spent our lunch hours doing. I was delegated to see the High Master and make our request with some facts and figures. He disliked me because he knew I didn't believe in Christianity, but St Paul's, after all, does have a large Jewish population, and virtually all my best friends were Jewish. So there was a kind of bedrock. He couldn't get more than a certain distance. He didn't like me. He didn't approve of chess because it wasn't a physical body contact sport, or at least a physical sport. But I was very polite. He was at least tolerant. And I explained to him that we had racked up a record which no team in the history of the school, we'd done our homework, had managed to equal. Fencing had done very well, but even fencing were a bit behind us. And I requested very politely that we would have the right to wear, if we were members of the team, that's 6 people probably normally a year of the first team. He told me to go away and come back and see him in a week. When I came back, he said, "Well, Elvin, I've made up my mind. I'll tell you what you can do. You can have a chess club tie." The world exploded inside me, but I had to concentrate and listen to the conditions. On condition, he went on, that it is impossible to mistake it for a proper tie, sporting tie, and you will submit the design to me before I approve it finally. So I thanked him profusely and was told I could leave. Well, we got back and we designed a tie, black silk, thin silver diagonal stripes across it, which were the school colours, by the way, but not the ones used in the sporting ties, which are normally very garish. Took it back and he looked at it and said, "Yeah, well, I guess that will do." It was generally agreed we had the smartest tie in town, which we were pretty confident of. I don't know what they do now. They've had a very fine record, which I follow from the little newsletter from the school, but I don't know what their tie is, if they've got one now, whether it's the same or otherwise. But we won that one in a strange way. Perhaps I'll tell you why he disliked me. It was because I would always beat him in his special class on Christianity. He insisted I come. I asked to be excused and he insisted I come, and he got beaten up in argument there, which he disliked intensely. I tried to keep silent, but he would say, "Elvin, I see you don't agree with that." I say, "Well, that's true, sir, I don't. Will you explain why?" Then there would come a tsunami. And that wasn't good. When I went back to the school, he was the only master there who wouldn't speak to me.
Let's stop on that point. So, Mark, you won a scholarship at 16, you wandered around the continent, and then you went up to Cambridge. Which college did you go to?
Well, for yours and mine, to King's.
King's, the best. Why did you go to King's? I mean, it's just...
Because my grandfather went there.
Oh. He was an Elvin, was he?
Dutton.
Dutton.
He was the chap who became a Unitarian minister when he migrated to America.
Right.
So it was simply a way of, if you like, making a choice without having to think too much about it, because the menu was, for someone at that age and with that lack of experience, far too big. It was like you wanted to take an a la carte menu and turn it into a table d'hôte, and it seemed easiest way to do it. It proved very interesting. I actually had Isaiah Berlin on my interviewing panel, and I took my interview with a temperature of about 101.
Gosh.
Full of aspirin and what have you. And he asked me questions about Spinoza, and I hadn't actually read a word of Spinoza, but I'd read quite a number of books about him, so I think I just about got by on that second-hand knowledge, but feeling thoroughly ashamed of myself, but he seemed quite happy.
What did you read at Cambridge?
I read history, beginning with, obviously, medieval and modern European history. And finally, I moved as a special subject to Chinese history. I was the only person to get a first, actually I got a start first in history with that particular special subject, which was on the Boxer Uprising.
Oh.
So that was what opened that particular door.
Who were your teachers?
The only person I regard as really memorable, some were quite good, some were, I won't say awful, but below the standard one would have expected, was Mary Chibnall, who was quite special.
Marjorie? Or Mary?
Marjorie, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Marjorie Chibnall. And I only did a term with her, but I suddenly had this... Sorry, thank you for correcting me. It's probably 30 or 40 years since I last thought about that. But it was instantly recognisable as real scholarship. And so I retained an extraordinary, pity I didn't study with her more, a great affection for her. Walter Ullmann wasn't bad too. It was very useful to have him as a guide to reading medieval Latin, which actually I've put to use again recently.
Yes. And in King's you must have had Christopher Morris.
Christopher Morris was a family friend, but let's just leave it at that.
And John Saltmarsh?
Similar comments. I'm sorry, these are people who are characters, but they were not in any sense kind of historian that I'd expected. Marjorie Chibnall certainly was.
Was Eric Hobsbawm there then or not?
No.
No.
At least I didn't meet him, which is strange if he was there.
Poston, was he there?
Poston was at Cambridge, and I listened to one of his series of lectures, which was pretty good. I mean, I learned later to get a very great respect for him indeed, but the lecturing style was quite hard to follow, a bit explosive, and but no, I mean, I learned, and of course, that he was a giant, but it wasn't immediately obvious from the lectures, which were obviously very learned. But and I think the only other person who I went to who really stuck in my mind, and now my memory not having been primed, was somebody who began very well and very modestly, and then got a little bit above himself, who talked largely upon Paddington and Oceania. You'll remember who it was.
Oceania?
The book.
Oh, I see, yeah.
And Harrington.
Yes, yes.
Very, very well-known name, which has just temporarily slipped my mind. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right.
So, no, I got far more out of going to lectures on non-historical subjects. In fact, that was the great thing about Cambridge. I could go off to John Wisdom's lectures as a sort of semi-Wittgensteinian approach to philosophy. I could go to lectures on anthropology, and I could go to all sorts of other things. So in fact, as far as lectures were concerned, I hardly went to a single history lecture at all, practically, at some points.
This was about 1957, 58, something like that?
I got my degree in 59.
56, yeah.
56 it began. So I mean, Cambridge was an enormous intellectual stimulus. By going to lectures, I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's broadly true, which were not directly part of my subject. I mean, I've always regarded these other subjects as being an integral part of the analysis of the human experience, which is what history is meant to be about across time.
Yeah.
And therefore, I mean, I suppose, although the anthropologist I probably learned most from in the end was Bill Skinner in the Chinese field, people like Meyer Fortis, I mean, wonderful people to talk to. And
you meet Edmund Leach?
Yes, though I didn't know him. I mean, Meyer I got on very well with, possibly because he was a friend of my father's. But
Jack Goody?
Oh, Jack Goody, of course, yes. I mean, Jack Goody's wife at that time, Esther, was, of course, an old school friend of my wife.
Was she?
So,
in America?
Well, that actually came to the picture more after I'd graduated. But to be accurate about time, but no, there was and there were people like Moses Findlay who were fascinating on slavery and classical history and so on. So, but that wasn't part of the syllabus. It was wandering outside the bounds. I mean, I could do a pretty good job myself in a few days, even then, on getting together a basic bibliography for myself on the mainline things, because there was plenty of starting points. But new starting points, new perspectives. Cambridge was absolutely priceless that way. And I should have to stop and think, but I went to a great number of things.
You had an interest in science. Did you attend any science lectures or anything?
No, I did talk to some other people into sciences, but at that point I hadn't got too deep into it. But it was completely obvious to me, you may disagree, that if you're going to try to get a mental, please do if you like, and then challenge me, if you're going to get a grip on what ultimately, at the very bottom, distinguishes what we loosely and rashly call the modern era, because of course some was around in Archimedes' time, it is fundamentally something to do with the nature of whatever modern science is in terms of modernity. And I found that trying to get a grasp of this was something which I gradually got more and more interested in. It's evasive, but it's not unreal. It's more of a snark than a boojum, perhaps. But it's very evasive, and so I was always very careful, because of my limited knowledge of science at that point, still is very limited, to explore but not to come to conclusions. But I was interested. I knew Gert Birkdahl, for example. I was actually given his book in draft on Newton to read, to see if his explanation of Newton's Principia was accessible to a layman. The answer is partially, and I know he was very disappointed, because it was a very well done book, I think, but it was difficult. So I was always aware of this, and also very conscious of the need to take this particular one very slowly, because it was of extreme importance and also precarious for me.
You said you did Chinese as a special subject. Who did you do that with?
I did it with a strange man called Victor Purcell, with whom I actually argued a good deal, because at this point I began to argue. I'd spent my almost entire summer vacation at British Museum Newspaper Library, which was then probably still is Hendon, and I had read every page of the relevant period covered, which is the Boxer uprising, its, as it were, its build-up and its aftermath, in the North China Herald, which was probably the best single source to read. And I knew that I was the first person to have read it there, because I cut all the pages. And true enough, it turned out that he had not read it. So we had a set to, I would quote the North China Herald back at him. We settled down to an amiable, after a big flame-up in which I stood up for myself.
Yes.
He was a bully, so I just hit straight back. And so at that point we had an amiable draw and got on quite well afterwards. But I was shocked that he hadn't read a very important primary source, which I had read. But that was very interesting.
Were there other sinologists? Was Joseph Needham there then?
I wasn't a sinologist at that point. I was a historian. No, the sinology came in for purely pragmatic reasons. I mean, I always approached history, at least from that time on, as essentially involving the framing of a question. And I went around looking for questions that seemed to be interesting. My first paper in public at the Old King's Political Society,
which was held in my room, which you'll come to.
Yes, I know. Was on Cathars and troubadours, on the Mouse in China.
Did you know Arthur Hibbert then?
I knew Arthur Hibbert. I liked him personally. I liked him, but he wasn't any help with that particular subject. But I know he's a very nice man. And I said, why should you get troubadour poetry, as in the Hillenbergen anthology, for example, at the same time as you get the Albigenses, the Cathari, in apparently much the same society? What on earth could they have had in common? I don't think I came up with the right answer, but I think I posed the question quite effectively. And I read some of the sources. I read the Chronicle of Pierre de Cernay, for example, in Latin, and was amused by the way as you went through it. Every now and then there'd be little italics put in by that. It says Miraculum, and so on. And I read Hillenbergen to the best of my ability. I mean, I had good French and I spoke rough Italian, so that was
Slowly.
not impossible. But all the same, it was a typical operation. I took on something that was, in a way, beyond me, but because the question was interesting, I think did set thoughts moving. China came simply because of three very obvious questions, which ultimately derive quite directly, and at least two of them do, avowedly from Max Weber, and the third probably does too, really, as well. Given, and here Weber was not up to speed, but that's a different issue, that China, particularly after the early publication of Needham's work, was clearly at some point technically ahead of the West. I take the height of the Middle Ages, take 1100 perhaps as a reference date. Why did China not have something like an industrial revolution? Why didn't it have a scientific revolution? And whatever happened to democracy? The last being an add-on, really. Later on I rephrased that, but that was the primitive form in which it came. And I took up Chinese immediately after I'd done my final examinations, in order to begin to equip myself to look at what seemed, after Weber had set the way, he underestimated China seriously, because he didn't want to read Jesuit works. If he'd read Jesuit works seriously, and I have read in Heidelberg University Library the very copies of the memoirs concerning the Chinese, which Weber would have had to hand if he'd wanted them. Why did China quite clearly not succeed in carrying on from its mid-medieval preeminence, as we now were getting to see from Needham, in certain very relevant areas? So that was the continuation of this habit of asking questions, and why I sat down to get the tools of the trade, which took me far longer than I had imagined. I mean, I rampage quite easily through European languages if I really get settled down with a dictionary. Chinese is a different proposition. Got very badly stuck for a while.
How long?
A year and a half before I was beginning to produce anything I could put footnotes to. And even then, after that, it remained still a long, hard slog. At that point, I was actually moving, but I went to Harvard and took courses that Fairbank had there for 2 years and learned academic Japanese in a special course. After that, particularly about pillaging Japanese work as an intermediate halfway house, because they're very, very good, I was able to at least get some movement. But Cambridge was above all interesting for opening the mind. Technically, I don't think in my area of history, you must speak for others that you know better than I do, a bit disappointing. With, I said, singular exception of Chibnall. I said, oh, we know that. Somebody who knows what she's doing. Right. Oh. And it was not disappointing in terms of opening the horizons to all sorts of other subjects.
When you said that it was Chianye, it wasn't Peter Laslett, was it?
No, it wasn't. He's gone to America,
Yeah.
this chap, and he had a lovely habit, I remembered. Now, Peter I did know later, got on quite well with. He had a lovely habit of saying, I would invite you to agree with me that, which I found charmingly modest, and then produced a very powerful point. So I thought this was a lovely combination. He's very well known as he got American egotism after going there for a while, and so while still remaining a very
wasn't
remarkable...
Pocock or...
Pocock, yeah, it was Pocock.
David, yeah, J.G.A. Pocock.
Do you recognise my description? But I mean, but he began brilliantly.
Yeah.
And humanly and charmingly. And the quality was very high.
Yeah.
So the Oriental Institute was a different game again altogether. I went there. I studied for a year at my own expense. I didn't get a state scholarship. I lived off £250 for a year.
Why didn't... I mean, you got to start first.
I got to start first and I didn't get a state scholarship.
How strange.
Well, I lived on £250. My father paid my book bills.
And you were still at King's?
I was still accepted. I could still dine in King's and use its facilities. But for that year I worked round the clock. And I lived in a room which was cheap because it was exposed to garage fumes in Victoria Street. And at the end of it I got a state studentship, and a year after that I got an extremely well-paid fellowship to Harvard. So it was quite an interesting up and down ride. But the quality of teaching at the Oriental Institute was extremely good. There were two quite remarkable people there, in fact more than that really, but three really, I dealt with were all master sonologists. And it was not easy. They didn't believe in letting you take crampons up the north face of the Eiger or anything, or slings you just to go with your fingernails. But you got to the top fast, and there was a heck of a view at the top. So that is Ted Pulley-Blank, still alive, or was when I last was in Canada, Dennis Twitchett, and Pete van der Loon, that's gone now, who later on became professor at Oxford. I mean, this was suddenly going and move. I mean, they had very limited visions historically, I think, very restricted, but as the art of extracting fairly accurate information from extremely difficult texts, which is what sonology is about, they could hardly have been bettered anywhere in Europe at that time, taken together. So I was again extremely lucky.
What was it like going back to America?
Well, it was a different world. I'd been back intermittently when my grandparents were alive. But one was conscious of living on the edge of something dangerous all the time. Occasional encounters with the police, just an accident, left one with a very uncomfortable feeling. And of course my introduction to America when I came back that time was to corruption. I came by boat, one of the last generation to go there by boat. So I love the transatlantic voyage. Arrive in New York, and there is
about 62. Yeah.
And I am met by a very courteous member of the Commonwealth Foundation. But my luggage has to go through customs, and the customs man opens my main bag and sees a pamphlet issued in English by Mao Zedong. I'm going to Harvard to study Chinese, among other things, politics. He said that is subversive or something similar, and you're not allowed to take that. And at this point, I didn't know what to say. I explained it. It was because I was working on this subject at Harvard, and I could demonstrate all this. And then I turned around to see where the Commonwealth representative had gone. He'd vanished. I thought, well, that is fun. Well, I hope this doesn't end up at Ellis Island, but it's looking unpleasantly entertaining. Well, I kept the conversation going, and he didn't seem interested. And then the customs man was summoned somewhere, somehow. And I was standing there with my open bag, wondering what the dash expletive was going on. A bit later, a man with a caricature face of a baby boxer, beaten up. I learned later he was called Jampole, appeared with the customs officer from behind a pillar. And the customs man said, "Educational material?" I said, "It sure is." Slammed it shut, put chalk on it. "That's right," he said. And as I was taken away by the customs by the now miraculously rematerialized representative of the Commonwealth Foundation, he said, "It just cost us $50. Jampole was a fixer employed by important employers and their associates to deal with, if you like, routine problems of misunderstanding with the customs, and they knew the tariffs. That was, I was teased for about 6 months at receptions by the foundation about this. People got bored of that and moved on to somebody else. It wasn't actually a prelude of things to come at that point, but it was quite a shock. I mean, Harvard was further professional training, extremely important. Again, the mental horizons of Harvard sonology at that time, the techniques were very good. The library fantastic. Were again also extremely narrow. I mean, again, I was aware that at the end of the day I was far more with sociologists like Bill Skinner, Skinner claims to be an anthropologist, but at any rate.
Yeah.
But later on, of course, Maurice Friedman and many others whom I got to know quite soon. Of course, back it was in LSE at that time, I think. Were much more my style of finding the questions I wanted to answer. And that was a source of discomfort. I remember once a bit later, when I was a minor established beginner in the professional field, went to a conference in New Hampshire, Wentworth by sea, where, if you like, Bill Skinner had tried to have a multidisciplinary approach, and one of the people there was Arthur Wright, a heavyweight God professor from Yale, overrated, unlike his wife was underrated, was brilliant, and died young. And he sort of thought, as a historian, I would be an ally against the dread anthropologists and sociologists. And I remember he actually came walking out of a session with me and said, "Well, Mark, the historians won that one, didn't they?" Goodness, what do I say? I don't want to have bad relations, but I don't believe a word of this. So I said, well, I thought we made some contact, or something boring like that. I fudged it. But I remember being actually genuinely shocked. However, that's jumping ahead in time.
How long were you in Harvard?
For 2 years. I could have stayed to do a PhD there. They offered it to me, and it would have been a compliment. It was a compliment. But I was aware of the time consumption, the money consumption of doing general exams in America. Whereas back in Cambridge, I just had to write a thesis.
Yeah.
I'd also been offered a job at Cambridge at that point as an assistant lecturer, and very generous terms to let me have enough time to finish my thesis, which I'd already begun. It was on the first democratic institution in China that actually functioned, run by Chinese. A book that in the end, because of Fairbanks' hostility, was postponed from publication, and then in the end never published, though I pillaged it for articles. Never published as a whole.
Right. So you didn't publish it, but you were writing it there, or when you came back?
I began writing it there. But what's interesting is the again the role of chance. This is genuinely unexpected. I had a great row in private, one-on-one with Fairbank, about how I was rewriting my thesis for publication. He was too important to have a violent disagreement with, so I just dug my heels in and blocked. But we left in a very unfriendly mood. He didn't like even polite blocking. I wasn't established enough to risk tangling with the overwhelming dominant figure and patronage in the field. I might want a job in America. A reference from Fairbank. We'd done nearly at that period decisive in getting something at any rate, and I didn't know if I was going to move or not. But I couldn't write it his way because it was wrong. I'm sorry, it was wrong. And so I needed to do something else. I got a contract from Weidenfeld and Nicholson to write a short history of modern China. Well, I soon realized as I sat down to fill up my time while I recovered psychologically doing this, that I needed to go back to what I later called, and people have usually adopted this term, the medieval economic revolution in China. Think of Marco Polo as symbolizing that time and event. So I wrote the book backward, having written most of the part on, not all, the more recent period. I then wrote the medieval period, and then I had a sense of how I was going to write the first part, which is from roughly when the empire crystallized. And I wrote that book with a very gentle thanks to John Fairbank for his generosity in letting me pursue another project while I was there. And to my amazement, it became an almost overnight success. It was called The Pattern of the Chinese Past.
Sure.
And it simply ran through all the questions that I'd been raising in my last year as an undergraduate, with myself primarily, and explained at least a small part, but a useful part, of the problem that China ran into, which was having a very productive late or high medieval technology in farming, which did not advance technically much further, but spread around a very large part of the cultivable area, and then by supporting a much increased population meant that there was a kind of ceiling. There was no easy further progress, and a population growing and opportunities for things like, say, new large effective water systems increasingly disappearing, and the marginal return on effort clearly reaching in many cases a ceiling. This was the infamous high-level equilibrium trap, but at any rate, I'd established a number of things. Why China stayed together over the long run, the increasing medieval rate of improvement of technology in the Centre Core, which enabled them to finance and equip, ultimately, armed forces and administration strong enough to keep the place together just. And quite a number of other questions, including beginning on the science one, but I still hadn't got very far there. And so that was the result of that book, which in effect made my name, such as it was the result of a quarrel with John Fairbank and a disagreement which left me having to go sideways to continue at all under the circumstances.
Can I ask you something about that and have a glass of water if you...
Yeah, please.
I mean, the folk myth is that the famous phrase, the high-level equilibrium trap, was devised over a cup of coffee in Glasgow with another person.
Oh, yes, this is a very important story. It was something which got its name there and much of its substance, but I was aware of I studied the technology and come to the technological conclusion long before. Formulating it into a coherent form and generalizing it was very much the work, and it's not folk tale. I told it myself and tell it repeatedly with my very old friend Radharaman Sina, who was a lecturer in agricultural technology at Glasgow, where I'd moved after my assistant lectureship ran out.
Yeah.
And that saddened me because my name has been largely linked with that. It should be always either Sina and Elvin or Elvin and Sina. I have no preference. But the famous graph, which of course ultimately borrowed from Ricardo, as Rado would be the first to admit, but was found to fit by him, not by me. What I contributed was a fairly detailed amount of research on how that technology reached a ceiling. He put it into a neat, memorable, marketable form, and also, I think, from the economist's point of view, into one that could be formalized. It was very important. And I have tried, every time I've talked about that, I hate talking about it now, it's boring, but it stood up incredibly, and I always try to stress that it was Elvin and Sina or Sina and Elvin, whichever way you like, and he has not received, if there's credit due, anything remotely like the credit he needs for it. And I don't know, again, why that happened, but
well, you wrote the book.
I wrote the book, and I gave a paper on it quite a long time before that.
Yeah.
But in 1969.
So if China hit this high-level equilibrium trap, why did Europe not hit it?
Well, it's partly the result of the structure of farming. I mean, this is fundamentally most evident in the most productive farming, productive per acre, at least, which is wet field rice farming. So you have to break it up a certain amount. But what happened, and this is a grotesque oversimplification, but it captures something critical, that the Southern Sung and later dynasties of Chinese, well, the Ming and of course the Qing was Sino Manchu, of basically a Chinese caste or character, taxed farming on the acreage of cultivable land. And there was some grading, but rather rough and ready by the general fertility, and it tended not to be revised very often, in fact hardly at all. And so what do you do if you have got, say, a hectare, or shift measurements, or an acre of land? You try to produce as much out of it as you possibly can, because you pay your tax at the same level once and for all each year. If you can get a second crop out of it, if you can grow an intercrop, if you can even do more than that and have a few things growing, particularly in the winter, which you can harvest, all of that is just pure gain. So the Chinese concentrated brilliantly on heavy fertilizing, so that fallow soon disappeared completely. And by the Southern Sung, people are already commenting on a place if it's still got fallowing, at least in the south and centre. You develop all forms of intercropping you can, all forms of rotation you can, anything to keep the fertility of that priceless little piece of land going. Because if you open new land, you have usually I think a 3-year either no tax or low tax grace period, after which you pay tax on it. And so as far as people could, they put productivity per acre up, and they put productivity in the end per hour of human work down. And it is that scissor effect which is characteristic of China. And it grows to some extent out of the fiscal system. It's much easier to collect taxes that way. And to some extent out of the fact that a system where irrigation can be refined and refined is capable with fertilizer of going way up the per acre productivity, even as the per hour productivity tends to drift off. I don't think in general, both irrigated and well fertilized farming in Europe, that anything like as acute as that developed. The dependence on water was extremely important. Most of the China Plain and large, lesser patches of central China are essentially former marshes, which filled up and have been drained. And so the amount of land that was already proto-leveled, or partly leveled already, was very great, and also very fertile, or potentially fertile. But China then got into, among other things, a very severe fertilizer shortage. And it ultimately needed Justus von Liebig, not Chinese, to find the way out of that particular trap.
Before that they were using soy.
They used everything they had their hands on. They had the kids out in the winter on the roads to get leaves, and they picked up dung of pigs and cattle and everything. The number of cattle fell because it was only in certain upland areas that anything like a large number of cattle were workable economically. So you have an upland regime which is a bit different. So the large animals tend to drop. Scavengers like pigs and poultry go up. And you keep on pressing. And the extreme ingenuity, but the returns for the effort put in go down and down.
Seems that it's almost exactly the same decade that Goethe's Agricultural Involution book comes out, and there is some similarity between the two ideas.
I'd heard of Goethe, but I'd never read him till afterwards. But the Chinese practice of this, of course, goes really back to around, take the year 1000. It's a very good rough measure of when it begins to become an important development, and it spreads. And one of the things that the Chinese bureaucracy did achieve, a great economic value, it's often downgraded, and it certainly had bad aspects, was that officials had to move around the country. They went to a place that was in their view backward. They would introduce and get credit for introducing more intensive, labour-intensive techniques of farming. So you got in the end an agricultural base which was subject to very different rules and had enormously reduced possibilities. I mean, when fertilizer was always used to some extent, I think, in English farming, you know more about this than I do, until the 18th century, but it was there, but it wasn't everywhere. In China it was everywhere and repeated. And they became masters of such techniques as halfway through the crop putting on fertilizer. Delicate business, you can get it wrong, but you don't just begin off by fertilizing the soil, you actually put a second layer on. And they even imported fertilizer materials, mostly soybean cake from Manchuria, by sea, down to what's now Shanghai, to try to make up this deficit. It was an economy that in the end, though amazing in its own way, was under tremendous pressure. I mean, there's a great deal more to say, but that was a huge stumbling block. It's still there, actually.
That, I mean, we're jumping ahead a great way, and perhaps we'll do it. I mean, you had shown a kind of barrier and block, and something that was extremely difficult to get beyond. As you know, in about 2000 or a little before, a number of Californian historians, of whom Pomerantz is perhaps the best known, argued that in fact there was no block, that the West and the East were roughly at the same level till 1800, and then the Great Divergence took place.
Well, there are two comments on this. Firstly, it isn't true. As far as farming is concerned, there are many areas where China was actually ahead for a while. And, I mean, the use of iron metallurgy from the Han onwards, from cast iron tools, is amazing. It's far ahead of the West. But the real point is that they don't read the best studies, and they don't get involved, as I did, in the reality of wet agriculture particularly, but Chinese-style farming. I walked around fields. I was interested above all initially in water control systems. There are certainly interesting water control systems in Europe, studied briefly by Brodel among others, but nothing like the gigantic systems or the enormous reliance I think you find in China in percentage terms. And they don't study the difference in the problems of keeping the soil going. I mean, fallowing alone gives the game away. No, they're quite wrong, I'm afraid. But what's more, they're wrong for a very interesting reason. They stopped reading German. I discovered, admittedly, after coming to these conclusions broadly myself, that there was a massive authority in the form of Wilhelm Wagner, whose book in 1926, based on over a decade of teaching farming to Chinese in China before the First World War, and household budget surveys, as well as a very well-trained chemical knowledge of what's involved in farming as of that period, that he'd more or less said it already in a book of about 600 pages, which I've now read, but I hadn't at that point. Nobody reads it, and yet it's still completely relevant. You cannot read that book and believe anything about the comparability of farming in the two areas. As a general rule, of course, there are always small pockets where this kind of thing can be supported. I don't think they've done their homework. Americans don't live on the land anymore. They did once, but they have lost a feeling for what it's like. They don't. It's imaginary. Also, I studied technology a great deal. I wrote about it. I reconstructed the first multi-spindle water-powered spinning machine, which was already in a book in China in 1314, the Agricultural Encyclopedia Nongshu of Wagner, and that was actually passed as workable, though rickety, by Dundee firm of spinning engineers, who sent me a charming letter, I've still got it, suggesting numerous improvements in your medieval machine. But they agreed it was workable, and it had multiple rotating, in effect, equivalents functionally of flyers to give the twist, and a pulling device which pulled it out. And it was primarily for long fibres, like, for example, hemp or flax. It would not have worked well for short fibre cotton, but it was, if you like, arkwright many hundreds of years before the event. What's interesting is there were links, of course, between Italy, in silk handling, Italy and China. God knows how they got there. Well, there are many differences in the technology. There's something also surprisingly similar. And I don't know if anything came across either way, but at any rate, I reconstructed these things, and I don't think Ken, who is full of energy and ideas, has really got the basic knowledge to talk about what Chinese farming was like. And I certainly know that Japanese historians, with whom in particular I had contact, and from whose work I drew, people like Amano Motonosuke, though he didn't read my stuff, but I mean people who studied him and did, feel that the picture that was painted in that book was, and later works too, was broadly realistic. Now, if you accept that this agricultural problem and you can get the essence of it from Wagner,
Mm.
is correct. Then the two systems are not fundamentally comparable. Where trouble comes is that, conceptually, if you don't think about it clearly, is that there are a number of Chinese genuine creations, far less than many people think, but they exist, which do match up even as late as the late 16th century with the best that Europe could produce. The most interesting, and one I've written on and done the maths for, going on from Needham and Robinson's work, is the system of equal temper tuning, which requires good maths. You need to know not just the 12th roots of 2, but the 24th roots of 2 for the diameters of wind instruments. Experiments, constructed boards for tuning, which were made for this purpose, and essentially results that in all but the most refined terms stand up today as well as they did then. And they're pre-Stevin, they're pre-Europe. Only by about a generation. Done in the 1570s, they were published in 1595, and Stevin wasn't even published, so that on such printing results, the Chinese win. By Zhu Ziyu. I've written about this at great length, with the maths. There are these cases that show that you can pick these few, they're rare, peaks out of Chinese world invention, and say until about that point at least they could still match here and there. But the system in Europe was by that point developing into something which is far more formidable than individuals. It was developing into an entire interacting system, which is the crux. China did not develop, outside some very limited fields, an interacting system which communicated, criticized, commented, financed, and passed down the generations. There are occasional peaks where you can be misled into thinking that China really had enough to have had modern science. There is this problem. The problem for Chinese science is that I think you could say that culturally most of the resources were there. I studied the history of probabilistic thinking in China, wondering why, for the gambling mad country, nothing like the work of Cardano or Fermat and Pascal or their successors, Huygens and so forth, had apparently developed. And I was able to show that all the mathematical tools, including Pascal's triangle, which is of course not Pascal's at all, but very ancient, the concepts of permutations and combinations were all present and used, well, probably by the end of the Song, but certainly they were around a bit later, all there, and yet they were never put together in such a coherent fashion that you have the basic system of Western probability. By basic I mean before Bayes made everything a bit more difficult, but basic probability for coins, cards, both used, they played with them, and all sorts of similar things. All the tools were there, and they got about halfway, and then, for reasons that are completely opaque to me, it just never got any further. But the first time you get a proper analysis of the relative probabilities of a simple gambling game and the correctly correlated payoffs is sometime in the 19th century, which is tantalizing beyond belief, because I can't see how we can rule out some European influence by this point. But it did happen. It wasn't quite complete, but it got most of the techniques of adding and combining, multiplying probabilities appropriately, not quite perfectly, but what you've got at any rate is a demonstration of a latent cultural capacity, or semi-latent, that was never properly realized except in a few odd cases. It is ultimately tantalizing. China did not have modern science, that is balderdash. On the other hand, people who write it off, like Toby Huff, a very interesting man, completely missing the point. It is a knife-edge case, which is perpetually tantalizing one by partial, or occasionally, as equal temperament tuning, isolated complete successes. But it never turned into a coherent system of socio-intellectual interaction, and there's a vast gulf there. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I like Ken, he's a good-hearted chap, he stirred up a lot of interest, but I simply do not buy the fundamentals, and I have looked at things in detail. The techniques of wet field farming, and also certain aspects of technology, things like the spinning, which died out. I forgot to mention that water-powered multi-spindle spinning died out in China by the Ming period. The end of the Ming, it was merely a memory in increasingly badly executed woodcuts and garbled texts that have been very difficult to reconstruct, but can be.
Did this great Susong clock.
Oh, the clock, which is of course a water wheel, which goes round in big ticks as a bucket, fills up and then tips.
That died out too. I mean, that was just.
Well, that was brilliant, but it is not. It is not, if you like, a reiterating or recycling mechanism in quite the same way as, say, a Virgin Folio clock is. Again, why it shouldn't have led that way, I don't know. Virgin Folio is as simple a mechanism intrinsically, in fact, it's more simple in many ways, than the elaborate escapement that Needham and de Solar Price reconstructed very accurately. And, I mean, they knew that the temperature should be kept constant, the water gets more viscous and doesn't flow so fast. And they had to have the right level in the tanks for the equal pressure. They got all that. They got a long way and then it stopped. So China is perpetually teasing one. That's a very good example of the clockwork. It gets so close and it doesn't build up any momentum. In the case of clockwork for astronomy, it's something of an imperial monopoly, not completely. And therefore there are problems perhaps in it spreading widely or interesting people. But there is a very big difference. The first time that Western history really starts to move away from Chinese history is ultimately in developing the system out of which modern science developed. And I've also studied this. I mean, I've studied, as you know, in more recent years, history of plant science relating to one topic which interests me. The proper demonstration and analysis at the first level, of course still going on, of the reality over a very wide range of flowering plants, not everyone, of a basic sexual method of reproduction. Of course there are others like layering and forms of propagation and grafting. Now that is a wonderfully interesting case of where ultimately, I suppose you can say, apart from the stimulus from the beginnings of the modern scientific revolution in other fields, not without its influence, is an age-old subject that had got going again in the Middle Ages, later Middle Ages, through commentaries and corrections, and then steady extensions and refinements and systematizations and improved observations. Until it crosses a frontier quite late in the 17th century, where serious, properly constructed experimental proof is used, and you are suddenly in a different world. And yet each step is so slight, unless you've followed it through, almost like grandmother's footsteps. It's hard to know how it happened. I think I've done this. That was interlinked with a constant intercourse and criticism and debate. And you just do not find this kind of intensity, even in the greatest of the late traditional Chinese botanist pharmacologist like Li Shijun, the enormous 1695 work. I mean, it still doesn't look too bad against things like Fuchs's Herbal, either Latin or German, which are very impressive. It's still in runner's terms, he's still up with the pack, even perhaps at the back of the pack, up with the pack. The time you get to the middle of the 17th, above all the later 17th century, the gaps opened, and then systematic experiment begins to come in. And you crossed a line. And it went on.
I'm going to now move on.
It's simply different. I've studied both in detail.
Yep. Well, we've got 10 minutes and we've got the rest of your life and your family and everything. You came back to England, then you went to Glasgow.
Yeah.
For how long?
Just 5 and a bit years.
So we'll skim over Glasgow, because you then, when did you go to Australia? Was it after?
Well, I came to Oxford for 17 years.
Oxford for 17 years. Oh, well, we better mention that.
Well, actually, oddly enough, at Oxford, I had a very profitable time in many ways. I was a single father, because my first wife, with whom I'm still on good terms, she's a very fine poet, Anne Stevenson. Indeed, she even wrote me an email a few days ago, asking me why Chinese Buddhas smile.
Yeah.
That's it for another occasion. But I was left with 2 sons. I did just enough research to keep me, as it were, myself in play, and otherwise I worked mostly at teaching and administering and bringing them up. So apart from doing a historical atlas of China, which is a lot of work, very interesting, and which turned me again towards the history of the environment, which had always interested me, way back, ever since my grandmother, whom I mentioned, gave me a copy of Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us, her first important popular book. And also being brought up for a time in a shared household with the younger sister of the other family, but the younger sister of Eve Balfour, of course, is famous in this world as an ecologist, environmentalist. And I learned to make compost heaps when I was 9 or 10. So at Forest Hill, outside Oxford. But the Atlas moved me back towards saying that there's a missing dimension to my economic history, and that is the environment. And this again is something that Ken has worked on it rightly. I don't think he's come to terms with the extent to which China was an overworked and exhausted countryside, except for a few peripheral areas like Manchuria. Long before the crisis caused by the West had really begun to bite. And indeed the West rescued China, above all with people like Justus von Liebig and chemical fertilizers. I'm sorry to say it that way. I'm going back to a common sense traditional view here, but I do know an awful lot of details, and I would support this very seriously.
So Oxford was sort of holding the fort, so to speak.
It did.
And then you...
Well, I worked on a few other things. I got very interested in women's history and published quite a bit on that, particularly on the cult of virtuous widows who didn't remarry. And so I did a number of things in this area, originally because of a desire to study population. And it turned out that the best sources for population were these enormously detailed and extensive, not enormously detailed, substantially detailed in the best cases, and very numerous mini biographies of virtuous, chaste widows, from which I was able to get, with a research assistant, Josephine Fox, who worked most of the time with me, usable, though limited, data on perinatal infant mortality. All of the other people, all the Californians included, do not have, for the main part of China, the way of checking up on very early deaths. If you take a census once a year, you're going to miss an enormous number of deaths in that kind of primitive, demographically primitive world, of kids who've died in a month or two, and they're numerous. I recently come across and worked, and I've got in, I hope, publication process, a paper made actually in the early 1930s where monthly checks were taken in the same area that we concentrated on, the lower Yangtze, and the models for circa 1814, our old one, and this fit like that. So much so I wondered if I'd been cheating. And so, I mean, all of the demography here, this is not true for the imperial family or for Manchu Bannerman, but most of the demography done by the California school is out of date and useless. Sorry, you can repeat that. They're nice kids. And it's because of a very difficult factor. Where do you control a massive, very much perinatal, it's above all the first few months, infant mortality? You can't, it isn't captured. But the widows, when they were widowed, it was recorded how many kids at what age, and often the kids' ages, they had alive when they were widowed. And when you've got 20,000 cases we have, you can make something of that. It's very rough, but it indicates it's big. And so we come back to a situation where the California school has tried to be too kind to China for very good motives. But I don't think the data, their data, and mine's publicly available on the internet. Very hard to handle. I had to develop special computer programs to handle it. Not complicated mathematically, but complicated conceptually. And it's all spelled out and examples are given. You come up with something which happens we didn't know this in advance, happens to match the one really detailed micro-survey made in the early 30s.
Wonderful.
With monthly visits to every household. So it was micro, but it's so close, I just thought, I don't believe this. So, I mean, I don't buy the California school. I am half Californian. My mother was Californian, and I'd love to say I'm part of the Californian school, but I'm not.
Mark, on that nice note, we've just got 4 minutes.
Okay,
I want to mention two things. One is you married again,
Yep.
Diane. Can you tell me something very briefly about Diane? She's a potter by...
Diane was trained at the Central School of Art in London, now linked with St Martin's, in both theatre design and historical costume.
Mm.
She practiced for a while in rep theatre. It's a tough trade until this was disrupted by the young man she was going to marry, more or less dumping her at the altar, not quite, but very nearly like that. And then she remarried. She didn't remarry, I'm sorry, she re-engaged. She would say herself a bit too soon, possibly. But at any rate, had two very nice children born who she then had to bring up herself because that marriage broke up.
Mm.
When we met, we were two single parents who both brought up two kids into their mid-teens. We knew exactly what the other was up against. And slowly and a little awkwardly, perhaps at first, we cemented an increasingly serious relationship. It's also the link, bizarrely, was my first wife, because my first wife, Anne Stevenson, was very good friends with Diane's parents. Dr. William Montgomery is a very distinguished Scottish poet and folklorist, and his wife Nora, who is a distinguished folklorist, and also did a lot of work for women's magazines in the 30s as a designer, very gifted visually. And so the Montgomerys, on Anne's recommendation, looked me up when they came to Oxford.
Mm.
And there was Diane. Well, it moved from that point onwards. And Diane has been a fantastic compliment because she's an eye person, not a word person, though she can be extremely precise and deadly when she wants to. She's too polite sometimes to say what she thinks openly. And it's certainly when working with things like plants, which I'm still very much a beginner, it's wonderful to have somebody who can identify an awful lot of things and find them very quickly right next door. So there was many links there, and
I'm going to interrupt
yes.
that for the last, which is just a 2-minute plug for your children's books.
Okay.
You've written a trilogy,
Yeah.
which is called The Dream God
Dream God trilogy.
yeah, under another name.
Well, it is and it isn't. My full legal name, and it was at birth, is John Mark Dutton Elvin. The Dutton is my mother's maiden name, and John was my first name until I went, in fact, to the Dragon, where I had something like 7 other Johns in the class.
Mm.
And I asked my father if please I could change my working first name to my legal second name. And very reluctantly he said, yes, but if you do change, you've got to stick with it.
And I'm going to, we've got 1 minute, the 3 volumes are privately, well, 2 are out.
2 are out, 1's written. The 3rd is written.
And they're called, the titles?
The first is called St Giles's Fair, the second is called Tiger's Island, and the third is called The Word Spider. They are a mixture of realism and fantasy. It is near the way that they seem to act in my mind in the real world as I can manage. Some of it's crazy, some of it's very realistic. It's really a book about children for adults rather than a book about children for children, though my 2, of course, grew up with it.
On that nice note, I think we'll running right to the last second. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. I'm sorry to rush you through the last bit.